going to do some of the logistical things now, and then we'll get into the program. First of all of you got a ticket that has a pairing. And if you look at it, it says pairing 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 8. That will tell you which two authors you will be seeing this evening. What is going to happen is that Westbeth residents will be guiding you to each of your readings. Because the last time we did this, we had a half a dozen people lost for half an hour to an hour. It is a building, this building is a whole city block large. And some of these apartments may be difficult to get to. So when we finish the program in here, each of the guides are going to line up here with a card that says number 1, number 2, number 3 through number 8, and then that's how you'll know who your guide is. They will also show you how to get to the elevators, and then when you switch apartments, they will be leading you. We only have one elevator here. When we finish here, if you can take the steps, great. If not, just wait for the elevator, and your guide will be waiting downstairs. That's it from my end. Thank you again for coming, and here's Beth Weinstein from Penn.
I just want to say a huge thank you. Welcome. A huge thank you to George Kaminsky, who is our wonderful partner from Westbeth. He's one of the beating hearts of this very special and important organization in New York. We were fortunate enough to partner with George and with Westbeth on the World Voices Festival, the 2011 World Voices Festival. We held a literary safari in which I know many of the Westbeth residents are well familiar with it, but we had festival guests kind of wander through the halls and kind of explore and find secrets and literary secrets and architectural secrets alike. It was really special, and we're so happy to be able to bring today the fall tasting. We have a bookseller from McNally, which is one of New York City's most beloved bookstores. They curate a wonderful shop. It's on Prince and Lafayette. And Dustin Kurtz is here, and he's going to be talking about fall books, the kind of secrets, the mysteries, the things you must read, maybe some of the things you could just avoid, I don't know. But anyway, I just want to say a huge thank you. I hope that you'll stay through to the reception where we can all be together and have a glass of Prosecco and talk about, the literature that we were fortunate enough to hear and receive. So thank you, George, and thank you all people from Westbeth. And thank you for coming. Okay, Dustin.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Dustin Kurtz. I'm from McNally Jackson Books, as she said, downtown, which is an independent bookstore. Obviously, if you've elected to come to a reading tonight, a book tasting, I'm going to assume I'm talking to the choir here. You know what an independent bookseller is. But just in short, that means, no shareholders. I buy lunchware. I sell books. We think of independent bookstores as something of a tent pole in the community. That is, we help buoy up a community around us. To a certain extent, I think that's more or less true. I like to say that bookstores are a collective noun, much like church. Rather than indicating sort of the building and the pews and all that, it's more an indicator for the community that makes it, the patrons that make a bookstore what it is. So thank you for having me out here tonight. Just real quickly, I'm going to talk about some of the books that I think maybe people have missed or have seen, but maybe glanced too quickly past here tonight. This season, of course, has been a big season for massive books. You have, let me see here, we have, of course, Murakami's 1Q84, or Q-Teen84, we like to call it. And then Eugenides, of course. These books clocking in at 900 pages with Steve Jobs' biography. Huge forests have been murdered senselessly to read these books. And for the most part, those are, they're fine, they're good. If you like Eugenides, read Eugenides. If you like the Murakami, by all means, read the Murakami. It's an excellent novel. If you like baseball and closeted homosexual relationships, read Chad Harback. That's an excellent novel, really worthwhile. But the big book that I really want to talk about first is by Peter Nadash. You may have heard of him. He's Hungarian. He writes in Hungarian about Germany and Hungary quite a bit. His earlier book, The Book of Memories, is sort of often talked about as one of the great books of the past century. And I maybe too glibly, but I sometimes call it my favorite novel. He writes big, dense, heady books, not so much character-driven as gesture-driven. He's kind of a virtuoso of the body. The book, being about the body is just chock full of cocks also, so, that's... it is a big, slow, hard book, so if you want something along those lines, next we have Mr. Fox by Helen Oyeyemi. She's British, shockingly young. I think she's something like 26 or 27. This is maybe her third or fourth novel. She's going from the place of the Jacksons with Shirley and Shelley, using a British folktale about Mr. Fox. It's sort of this Bluebeard tale of the murder, but imbuing it with sort of a lot of really, I don't know, a lot of brew and more character than you would think one person could cram into it. She's a big fan and has spoken openly about Barbara Comyn's, sort of a neglected British writer, and it's beautiful. It's kind of a quick read and not to be overlooked.
Can you repeat the name?
Sure, it's Mr. Fox by Helen Oyeyemi. And I should say that you guys are welcome to come down and see these books after the fact if you prefer. Oyeyemi, and it's just here. I think her family is Nigerian originally. It's Oyeyemi. Let's see then, what are we going on to next? Oh, you know what? I would be so remiss if I didn't mention actually two of the authors here tonight whose books I've particularly enjoyed. Sabrina Murray, whose book is going to be reviewed in the Times this weekend. A tale full of swashbuckle and murder and sort of her carnal predilections, like cannibalism. And Hal Foster, who has two big smart hardcovers on our front table in McNally Jackson right now, and whose earlier book, Design as Crime, I sold to a friend, and she told me, "Oh, you're amazing at this job," the next day. Whether or not that was because she loved the book or because she felt like I hoodwinked her and it was terrible, I don't know. But I think he's fantastic. You should attend his reading if you can. Where are we moving on to? Quickly. I don't know if you can't see, but I have this big hidden stash of books back here, so buckle up. Let's see. Let's move on to this. This book has the misfortune of having the single ugliest cover in the bookstore right now, but it is one of the most brilliant books in there. Gerald Murnane is the author's name. He's about a 70-year-old, I think. He's from Australia. This is published as a paperback original by Dalkey Archive Press. He is Proustian in every sense of the word, but Proust as translated by David Markson, the postmodernist. So the book is Catholic in the extreme, all about hidden layers and boys running to the rushes and hiding from sort of budding sexuality and sort of eating berries and dollhouses and genius stuff. But at the same time, it's framed within this he's trying to describe why he's given up writing, and talking about the power of the image in the writing and how when books you've read fade, what is it that stays and why does it stay? So utterly worth reading. He has another book coming out with them in May too, so if you skip that, worth seeing. Let's move on to something a little less tedious. This is called Like a Sniper Lining Up His Shot, illustrated by Jacques Tardy, written by Jean-Patrick Manchette, adapted from a novel by Manchette. It's a brutal graphic novel, spy fiction full of double and triple crossings. It's as if Hergé had sort of been mangled and reformed and grown necrotic and ugly. It's Hergé, I'm not belting. As you see, it's complicated and thick and full of slaps, and at one point a character grows mute because his identity has been revealed. It's very gnarly, but at the same time it's so fun. Dark too. Let's move on. Let's go to some essays, some nonfiction. I think let's begin with Joan Didion. Joan Didion, this is not a book that's been overlooked, but a book that deserves to be applauded. Joan Didion has been, probably will remain, one of the greatest essayists that we have in this country. She's sort of, her writing is in a very strange way drawn from the rhythms of her speech. She has a rhythm first, and the meaning tends to come out of it. Here she covers a lot of similar ground to Year of Magical Thinking, the death of her daughter, sorrow, but fear of her own mortality plays a much bigger role in this. she's coming to terms with things like her own body and physical therapy. So she's sort of covering Philip Roth territory, or W.S. Merwin's Shadow of Sirius. Even more poignantly, she loses some of that rhythmic magic in this book that we come to know her by, and addresses it within the book itself. The book doesn't sound like Joan Didion in Sergeant of Bethlehem. It sounds like Joan Didion trying to channel that Joan Didion. And so it's sadder and more beautiful for it, slim, and deserves the time. Another book, this actually has been out in hardcover from a university press, new in paperback with vintage. Edwidge Danticat, great, fantastic novelist. These are her essays, Create Dangerously, written before, during, and after the earthquake in Haiti, that great tragedy. She is Haitian, left there at a young age. So this is about there's an essay about bringing a gay cousin's corpse down to Haiti beforehand, or about visiting after it. I was brought to tears maybe twice, 3 times by the essays in this book. And I'm a little bit hard bitten, so that's not easy to do. Beautiful, worth the time. Let's move on to what do we have here? Another pairing here. You are, I'm going to assume, a literary crowd, so essays about books are certainly okay. Jonathan Lethem and Lawrence Wexler, both writing big, thick essay books, certainly to a certain extent about books. Reviews are involved with each. They both see themselves as sort of outsider artists, as bemused slash confused, and sort of examining things along those lines. Lethem in here plays with ideas of bricolage, of theft out and out. The Ecstasy of Influence, the title essay here, you may have read a couple years back, is written almost entirely in snippets from other essays, with some of his commentary in there and changing. It's a long sort of commentary on remix culture. Brilliant. Also, the first few bits in this take place in a bookshop, so obviously I melted when I read it. Wexler, instead of doing bricolage, is more about serendipity, about the found beauty. And he's made a career out of this. You may have seen his work in The Believer, among other places, and a few other books beforehand, where he discusses, isn't this strange that this happened? These connections, and it's obviously that's a very easy way to point to the ecstatic, is to say all of these things are happening around us. He pulls it off beautifully. Again, sort of just an unfortunately ugly cover, and I apologize for that. I had nothing to do with it. Oh my God, where? Mahmoud Darwish, you may know, especially if any of you are here as part of a pen list. Darwish has another book out with Archaeology this fall. It's just hit our stores today, called In the Presence of Absence. Darwish, for those of you who don't know, is the great late Palestinian poet. His work is suffused with the mundane, but then every now and then he sort of lets himself stray into the theoretical as pointing towards the beyond, like the Walter Benjamin sort of style, where he believes in the spirituality of things, but is using jargon to reach towards it. It's some of the sexier poetry you'll ever read, full of love, and more than anything, full of longing. It's a book about exile. All of his books are books about exile, as all Palestinian books are to a certain extent, but his explicitly so. This is sort of long prose poetry, beautiful in the extreme, hard to label, worth reading. Let's talk a little bit about poetry. What do I have here? Before that, let me do these two things that have come out that are, speaking of the difficult, if you guys are here at a literary reading, I'm not gonna coddle it, I'm gonna give you strange stuff, things you might not have seen. Mina Loy, I don't know if you've known, a poet. This is her first collection of story and essay from just out from Dalkey Archive Press. Beautiful. She writes sort of embodied fiction. She's a proto-feminist, a feminist, but also complicated. Beautiful reactions to futurism in there, reactions to the Walt Whitman, to the nuclear bomb, but also sort of full of louche female rebellion, women sort of spending money and lounging on couches and fucking people who they shouldn't, and it's, I don't know, it's entirely worthwhile, but again, a little bit different. thereby make beautiful. He's one of the closest things you can come to poetry within prose. He's also, because his sentences are so twisted and corrupted almost, he's stuck with a vocabulary of the mundane in his sort of day-to-day writings. So when he writes about our relationships, or about bad suit coats like this one, or things along those lines. And then he can't help but twist those too. So, there's not a man in a Gary Letts story that doesn't underneath his clothing have on fishnet stockings, it's about heartbreak and sex, and about the prose itself. Gary Letts is always about the prose itself. Strange, difficult, really beautiful. Now we can go on to poetry real quickly. What time is it, by the way? Okay, I've got a little bit of time. Another poetic pairing. These are both poets that address youth, maybe more than anybody I've ever seen. Tim DeLugos is a poet I just ran into this year myself, which is such an embarrassment. This book came out in May, so it's not strictly a fall book, but it holds such a place in my heart that I just need to push it on everybody. There's a Ted Berrigan blurb, I guess you can say, on the back, calling him the Frank O'Hara of his generation. And that's right, he's gossipy. A lot of the poems are about sort of random encounters, a lot of sort of sordid sex, and a lot of name dropping, both to people and poets and artists he was writing with, as well as sort of the products in his life. But Lugos benefits from O'Hara. He benefits from what came after O'Hara. So he's stylistically more profound a little bit. He's looser when it's appropriate to be looser, and he has more freedom to him, and that makes the poem sort of a big blessing. At the beginning, very sexy. Towards the end, he starts having thoughts about religion, and then the last few poems are him being sad and troubled by how petty he himself is as he dies of AIDS in a hospital. So not light towards the ending, but utterly essential reading. Here we go. Claire Becker, blindingly young in this book. It ranges from when she's maybe just turning into her 20s, and it goes maybe a few years beyond that. It reeks of it. It's terrible with youth. So it's full of her anxieties. It's full of blind spots. Even the way the page is laid out is hesitant, or where it's sure, it's mistakenly sure, but so beautiful at the same time. And obviously, nobody can ever be unsure as a poet. There's wisdom there that even we would find that she might not have been imbued with. From Octopus Books at Tiny Press, who if you've not run into them before, you should read. And also, not a bad looking book. And then, sort of in closing, let me pull up, one more poetry book. Gennady Ige, whose name I'm probably butchering, Chuvash poet. He has a book coming out from Wave Books this fall called Into the Snow. He wrote in Chuvash, which apparently is the native language of some part of the steppes south of Russia. He also wrote in Russian occasionally. So his book is thick with sort of nature imagery, but an acuity for structure that you won't find in many other poems coming out of there. It's savvy and smart and I don't know, it's addictive too. So look out for that one. I don't have it yet.
What was the name on that?
It's called Into the Snow from Wave Books, and his last name is Aygi. It's worthwhile. And lastly, in honor of November 17th, in honor of that Wall Street movement that's happening right now, just a little bit downtown, a couple books to address that. Debt by the anthropologist David Graeber, who was one of the organizers of the first meetup downtown. It's a book addressing mischaracterizations of the history of debt, what it means to have debt as a pervasive relationship, and how that shapes our politics from there on in. Again, it is an anthropological book from Melville House, I should note, a small publisher in Brooklyn. But he himself is a radical, an anarchist even. So it's entertaining, and you'll leave it, full of like sort of Malcolm Gladwellian aha quotes, but less shilling for sort of classist apology than that guy. Rich People Things by Chris Lamont. This came out of a column for The All, an online journal, a couple years ago. This is biting and so smart and full of facts, but at the same time not dry. It's enraging without being pandering, like some people are, and worth it alone for the introduction and the endnotes, which I wish I could take out and legally distill and just sort of pass out to everybody downtown. It's a call to arms, and if nothing else, just a call to hire, and that's okay too, right? I think that is it. If you guys have any questions, feel free to see me afterwards. Feel free to come and thumb through the books. And barring that, I'll see you in the apartments. Thank you.
We started a few minutes late because a lot of people were having traffic issues with the Occupy Wall Street demonstrations. So right now it is 7:30. If all of the guys, if you can just...
Are we good to go?
Yes, you are.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming to this wonderful event. We were just discussing how sad it was that there aren't any salons anymore. And while I don't think we could call this technically a salon, it's sort of salon-like in the intimacy of it. It's very pleasant. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about my book, which is called The Magician King. It doesn't look like this. This is the English edition, which for some reason I picked up as I was leaving. But this is the book. I think it's been out since August. I'll talk a little bit about it, and then I'll read a little bit from it, and then let's do some question and answer, which is always my favorite part. Although it is incumbent on all of you to think of questions. So everyone think of questions, or we're going to be in terrible trouble once I stop reading. This book came out of my love for young adult fantasy. When I was a child, like just about every child everywhere, I was obsessed with the Chronicles of Narnia, and also a lot of other fantasy, the Tolkien books, T.H. White, and McCaffrey, Fritz Leiber, all of that stuff that you read when you're a kid and you're supposed to grow out of, except I never quite grew out of it. And I've always kept going back to it, and then of course later to Philip Pullman and Harry Potter. And when I was beginning, not this novel, but the predecessor, which is called The Magicians, this is the sequel, I was thinking about what was the most absorbing and compelling reading experience I'd ever had. And if I was being honest with myself, and I was, it had been reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe when I was 8 years old. So I began to think about whether it would be possible. I didn't want to write a young adult fantasy novel. I don't know why, except that I didn't think I'd be any good at it. But I wondered if it would be possible to tell a story like that. A story about young people who were discovering that they had power that they didn't know they had. Young people finding their way into a secret world that no one else knows about. Would it be possible to tell a story like that? A story like those books that I loved, but to tell it for adults, using all of the sort of adult literary language that we're used to seeing in mainstream fiction, and leaving in all the stuff that young adult fantasy writers generally airbrush out, all the complexities of adult life, and all the sex and booze that you never get to see in Harry Potter, but you're sure it's there. And sort of some of the complicated moral ambiguities that those books sometimes don't deal with. I've always thought that Harry Potter was very lucky to have Voldemort in his life, even though, of course, he was the scourge of his universe and everything like that. I always thought it was very helpful for Harry to have someone in his life who was the incarnation of evil. In some ways, Harry was very clear on what he was going to do when he got up in the morning. He knew what he was going to do, which is that he was going to use his magic to try to defeat Voldemort. But what if you subtract Voldemort from that equation? What if you remove him from the universe? Voldemort had a very organizing effect on Harry's universe. If you take him out of that, suddenly you get a very different kind of world and a different kind of story. It's much less black and white, much more shades of gray. And you get a different kind of story. It's much less about using your magic to fight evil, and much more about trying to figure out if magic was real, what would it be for? What would you do with it? So I'm going to read a short passage from The Magician King. The magicians and the Magician King have two heroes. One of them is Quentin, who is a young man who is much too clever for his own good. And we're not going to worry about him too much because he's not in this bit. Instead, we're going to worry about Julia. Julia is Quentin's friend. They went to high school together. And Julia was in some ways inspired by a character in the Harry Potter world whose name is Dudley Dursley. Dudley was Harry's cousin, and he's fat and loutish, and you're meant to dislike him, and one does dislike him. But I always felt a little bit sorry for him, because I thought that if I grew up in a house with my cousin who I resented, and then the cousin got to go off to Hogwarts and be a magician, I would be very, very resentful of that. In the books, Dudley is sort of petty about it, and he's kind of contemptuous of Harry, but I would sit around and think, my God, magic is real, and it's going on all around me, and I can't do it. I can't be a part of it. What is this thing that's all around me that everybody else knows about, but I'm kind of cut off from? Well, Quentin's friend Julia, in this book, she, like Dudley, is left behind. She gets to take the sort of entrance exam for the big college for magic, but she, for whatever reason, is denied entry. And I'm just going to read you the very beginning of her story, where she takes that exam and then is made to forget it magically. But she doesn't forget it all the way. Something of a residue remains, and it haunts her with this awareness that there's something else out there in the world that she can't quite put her finger on what it is, and it kind of derails her life. She becomes obsessed with it and figuring out what it is. And this scene that I'm going to read takes place, it's the same scene that's at the beginning of The Magicians, the first book, but it's told from Julia's point of view. And so we get to sort of see what she was up to while Quentin was off having his adventures in The Magicians. You have to go back to the beginning, to that freezing, miserable afternoon in Brooklyn when Quentin took the Break-Bills exam to understand what happened to Julia, because Julia took the Break-Bills exam that day too. And after she took it, she lost 3 years of her life. Her story started the same day that Quentin's did, but it was a very different kind of story. On that day, the day that Quentin and James and Julia walked along Fifth Avenue together on the way to the boys' Princeton interview, Quentin's life had split wide open. Julia's life hadn't, but it did develop a crack. It was a hairline crack at first, nothing much to look at. It was cracked, but you could still use it. It was still good. No point in throwing her life away. It was a perfectly fine life. Or, no, it wasn't fine, but it worked for a while. She'd said goodbye to James and Quentin in front of that brick house. They'd gone in, she walked away, it started to rain. She went to the library. This much she was pretty sure was true. This much had probably actually happened. But then, something happened that didn't happen. She'd sat in the library with her laptop and a stack of books and written her paper for Mr. Karras. It was a damn good paper. It was about an experimental utopian socialist community in New York State in the 19th century. The community had some praiseworthy ideals, but also some creepy sexual practices. And eventually it lost its mojo and morphed into a successful silverware company instead. She had some ideas about why the whole arrangement worked better as a silverware company than it had as an attempt to realize Christ's kingdom on earth. She was pretty sure she was right. She'd gone into the numbers, and in her experience, when you went into the numbers, you usually came out with pretty good answers. James met her at the library. He told her what had happened with the interview, which was weird enough as it was, what with the interviewer turning up dead and all. Then she went home. She had dinner. She went up to her room. She wrote the rest of the paper, which took until 4 in the morning. She grabbed 3 hours of sleep. She got up, blew off the first 2 classes while she fixed her endnotes, and went to school in time for social studies. Mischief managed. When she looked back, the whole thing had a queer unreal feeling to it. But then again, you often get a queer, unreal feeling. When you stay up till 4, you get up at 7. Things didn't start to fall apart until a week later when she got her paper back. The problem wasn't the grade, it was a good grade. It was an A-. Mr. K did not give out a lot of those. The problem was, what was the problem? She read the paper again, and though it read all right, she didn't recognize everything in it, but she'd been writing fast. And well, the thing she snagged on was the same thing that Mr. K snagged on. She'd gotten a date wrong. See, the utopian community that she was writing about had run afoul of a change in federal statutory rape laws that took place in 1878, and she knew that, whereas the paper said 1881, which Mr. K would never have caught, although, come to think of it, he was a pretty creepy character himself, and she wouldn't be surprised if he knew his way around a statutory rape law or two. Except that Wikipedia made the same mistake, and Mr. K loved to do spot checking to catch people relying on Wikipedia. He checked the date, and he checked Wikipedia, and he put a big red X in the margin of Julia's paper, and a minus after her A. He was surprised at her. He really was. Julia was surprised too, because she never used Wikipedia, partly because she knew that Mr. K checked, but mostly because, unlike a lot of her fellow students, she cared about getting her facts right. She went back through the paper and checked it thoroughly. She found a second mistake, and a third, no more, but that was enough. She started checking versions of the paper, because she always saved and backed up separate drafts as she went, because track changes in Word is bullshit. And she wanted to know at what point exactly the errors got in. But the really weird thing was, there were no earlier versions. There was only the final draft. This fact, although it was a minor fact, with multiple plausible explanations, proved to be the big red button that activated the ejector seat that blew Julia out of the cozy cockpit of her life. She sat on her bed and she stared at the file, and she felt fear, because the more she thought about it, the more it seemed like she had 2 sets of memories for that afternoon, not just one. One of them was almost too plausible. It had the feel of a scene from a novel written by an earnest realist who was more concerned with presenting an amalgamation of naturalistic details that fit together plausibly, and with telling a story that wouldn't bore the hell out of the reader. It felt like a cover story. That was the one where she went to the library. She met James and had dinner and wrote the paper. But the other one was just batshit insane. And the other one, she'd gone to the library and done a simple search on one of the cheapo library workstations on the blonde wood tables by the circulation desk. The search had yielded a call number, and the call number was odd. It put the book in the sub-basement stacks. Well, Julia was pretty sure the library didn't have any sub-basement stacks, because it did not have a sub-basement. As if in a dream, she walked to the brushed steel elevator, and sure enough, beneath the round white plastic button marked B, there was now also a round plastic button marked SB. She pressed it, and it glowed. The dropping sensation in her stomach was just an ordinary dropping sensation, the kind you get when you're descending rapidly toward a sub-basement, full of cheap metal shelving, and the buzz of fluorescent lights and exposed pipes with red-painted daisy wheel valve handles poking out at them at odd angles. But that's not what she saw when the elevator doors opened. Instead, she saw a sun-soaked stone terrace in back of a country house with green gardens all around. It wasn't actually a house, the people there explained. It was a school. It was called Breakbills, and the people who lived there were magicians. They thought she might like to be one too. All she would have to do was pass one simple test. Just going to continue on a couple pages more, assuming we're on track for time. A funny thing happened to Julia after that business with her fake social studies paper. It was a magic trick, you might even call it. Where once there had been only one Julia, there were now 2 Julias, one for each set of memories. The Julia that went with the first set, the normal set, the one where she wrote the paper and went home and had dinner, did normal Julia things. She went to school, She did her homework. She played the oboe. She finally slept with James, which she'd kind of been meaning to do anyway, but for some reason had been putting off. But there was a second, stranger Julia, growing inside that first Julia, like a parasite or a horrible tumor. At first it was tiny, the size of a bacterium, a single cell of doubt, but it divided and divided and grew and grew. This second Julia was not interested in school, or the oboe, or even James particularly. The problem was that Julia was smart, and Julia was interested in the truth. She didn't like inconsistencies, and she didn't let go until they were resolved, ever, when she was 5. She'd wanted to know why Goofy could talk and Pluto couldn't. How could one dog have another dog for a pet? And one be sentient, and the other not? Likewise, she wanted to know who the lazy bastard was who wrote her paper on intentional communities for her and used Wikipedia as a source, granted that the answer, the nefarious agents of a secret school for wizards in upstate New York, was not a leadingly plausible answer to her question. It was the answer that fit her memories. And those memories were getting sharper all the time, and as they got sharper, the second Julia grew stronger and stronger, and every bit of strength she gained, she took away from that first Julia, who got weaker and weaker, and thinner, to the point where she was practically transparent, and the parasite behind the mask of her face became almost visible. Funny thing was that nobody noticed. Nobody noticed that she had less and less to say to James, or that 3 weeks to go before the holiday concert, she lost first chair in the oboe section of the very competitive Manhattan Conservatory Extension School Youth Orchestra, thereby forfeiting the juicy solo in Peter and the Wolf, the Duck's theme, to the demonstrably inferior Evelyn O., whose rendition of it did appropriately enough sound like a quacking fucking duck. Well, that was December. By March, she and James were hanging by a thread. She had dyed her hair black and painted her nails black in order to more accurately resemble the second Julia. James initially found this sexy and goth, and he stepped up his efforts in the sex department, which wasn't actually a welcome side effect, but it made a break from talking to him, which was getting harder and harder. They'd never been as good a couple as they looked. He wasn't a real bona fide nerd, just nerd-friendly, nerd-compatible. And you could only explain your Gödel-Escher-Bach references so many times before it starts to be a problem. Pretty soon he was going to figure out that she wasn't role-playing a sexy, depressed goth chick. She had actually become a sexy, depressed goth chick. And she was enjoying it. She was dipping a toe in the pool of bad behavior and finding that the temperature was just right. It was fun being a problem. Julia had been very, very good for a very long time. And the funny thing about that was, if you're too good too much of the time, people start to forget about you. You're not a problem. So people can strike you off their list of things to worry about. Nobody makes a fuss over you. They make a fuss over the bad girls. In her quiet way, second Julia was causing a bit of a fuss for once in her life, and it felt good. Then Quentin came to visit. She'd always liked Quentin. Basically, he was sarcastic and spookily smart, and on some level, basically a kind person who just needed a ton of therapy and maybe some mood-altering drugs. Something to selectively inhibit the voracious reuptake of serotonin that was obviously going on inside his skull 24/7. She felt bad about the fact that he was in love with her and that she found him deeply unsexy, but not that bad. Honestly, he was decent looking, better looking than he thought he was, but that moody boy man Narnia shit cut like zero ice with her, and she was smart enough to know whose problem that was, and it was not hers. But when he came back in March, there was something different about him, something otherworldly and glittery-eyed. He didn't say anything, but he didn't have to. He had seen things. There was a smell coming off his fingers, the smell you got after they ran the really big Van de Graaff generator at the Science Museum. This was a man who had handled lightning. They all went down to the boat launch on the Gowanus Canal, and she smoked cigarette after cigarette, and she just looked at him, and she knew. He had gone through to the other side, and she had been left behind. She thought she'd seen him there. The exam, at break bills, in the hall with a chalk clock, with the glasses of water and disappearing children, and now she knew she was right. But it had been very different for him, she realized. When he walked into that room, he had buckled right down and he had killed that exam. Because magic school? Well, that was just the kind of thing he had been waiting to happen to him his whole life. He practically expected that shit. He'd been wondering when it was going to show up, and when it did, he was good and ready for it. Whereas Julia had been blindsided. She had never expected anything special to just happen to her. Her plan for life was to get out there and make special things happen. She could have handled the math, God knew. She'd been in math classes with Quentin since they were 10 years old, and anything he could do, she could do just as well, backward and in high heels if necessary. But she'd spent too much time looking around, trying to work it through, the implications of it. She didn't take it at face value the way Quentin did. The test was the last of her priorities. It was the least interesting thing in the room, which she still stood by as the reasonable, intelligent person's reaction to the situation. But now, Quentin was on the inside, and she was out here, chain-smoking on the Gowanus boat dock with her half-orc boyfriend. Quentin had passed the test, and she had failed. It seemed that reason and intelligence weren't getting it done anymore. They were cutting like zero ice. It was when Quentin left that day that Julia really fell off the cliff. Thank you.
So maybe anybody who wants to or has a question would like to have a question. Yes, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Just have like two related questions. One that I just find interesting to ask a writer like yourself is, I'm just curious, how would you just simply define what is a word, and how is a word from your experience different from an image? What can an image do that a word, what's the relationship between the two? And I'm just curious about your process when you go into this magical world, and a lot of people say that they sort of like they surrender, and it's as if a voice is speaking through you. So, if you could just speak to whatever you choose to speak.
Yeah, well, I thought a lot about that, especially that first question about words and images. Because it's sort of a cliche to say that we've become a visual culture. And I remember this famous moment, Steve Jobs, the late Steve Jobs, who ran Apple, someone saying, "Are you going to make an ebook like a Kindle?" And he said, "Why? Nobody reads anymore." And so, it made me think a lot about what we as writers and readers are up against. Novels have there's a lot livelier competition for people's entertainment time and dollars than there were in, for example, the 18th century when the novel first appeared in its modern form. And I thought a lot about, why am I doing this? Should I go to Hollywood and be a TV writer? I would be very bad at that, one. But also, that the more I begin to think about it, if you think about what an image is, what a word is, if you think about an image file on a computer, just a JPEG, it's compared to a Word text file. It's a very large file. Video is huge. Images and music are medium-sized. Text files are very small. There's very little information in a word, just from an information science point of view. There's very few bits in it, which means that you, as the reader, are called upon to do a lot of work. You have to supply a lot of what's going on. You bring the information yourself. You decide what everything looks like and what it sounds like. You dress the set. You do the line readings. It's a lot of work. The reader is doing almost as much work as the writer in a book. And that really, it's good for you. It involves you in a book. You're the collaborator of the book. You're the co-author. And doing that work involves you in the story that's just textual in ways that I don't think movies and TV do. It's different. Not that I don't love movies and TV. Not that I'm not energetically trying to turn that into a television show as we speak. But it'll never be the same as the book. I'm a big advocate of the word, the written word, and its importance as something that we need to curate going into the new millennium, which I guess we're already in. I think if we become a visual culture, we'll be a poorer culture.
Any other questions from you?
So there's this whole secondary, I mean, it seems in your book you're playing this idea of two worlds, right? So you have kind of the magical world that, to some point, I'm assuming because I haven't read it, but there's kind of a suspension of belief or a faith or something like, the other books you talked about being influenced by the world behind, at the end of the wardrobe that the children can go into, and it becomes more, perhaps, visual and symbolic than the world outside it. So the big lion is Christ. There's all these images in it.
Yeah.
Is there a way that maybe kind of you're playing with some of these issues with the sort of cynical, rational outside world where you see some tricks, some magic, and this inside world is somehow more coherent and visual, or are you kind of pushing against that?
I would say in a lot of ways I'm pushing against it. As I said before, I was very obsessed with the Chronicles of Narnia when I was a kid. That was a really formative experience for me, reading about this story about a bunch of kids during the Blitz in England, which my mother lived through and tells stories about, finding their way into this world that, yes, was more meaningful. It meant more. It was more coherent, more organized. It was this place where they were heroes and they lived out this wonderful story. And I spent a lot of time thinking about how poorly that idea had prepared me for later life. And there's a level on which I think for years and years I thought, on some level I believed that I was going to stumble on a doorway to some other better world, which caused me to really lose a lot of interest in this world that we're in. So I wanted to push back in some ways against Lewis and write against him. Philip Pullman talks about that a lot, about how his work is a critique of Lewis's. And I think about my work that same way. I love Lewis, but I wanted to play with that idea. And so when the characters in The Magicians and The Magician King, they go to this other world, and they, funnily enough, they are fantasy readers as well. So they've read Narnia, they've read Harry Potter. They have a whole idea about what to expect. I thought this was a funny thing about the Harry Potter books, that Harry Potter never seemed to have read a fantasy novel. So he was just blown away when he got to Hogwarts. He had no idea, it's just amazing. Whereas I think that if I had grown up in this, locked in a closet, all I would have done was to read these stories. So I had my hero, and all the characters in here know about Harry Potter, and have some ideas about what this other world was going to be like. And then I had the pleasure of slowly demolishing those ideas, and this world that they believe is going to be meaningful and symbolic, and they'll be able to engage in this struggle between right and wrong, becomes more and more complicated and less clear, until it comes finally to resemble our world a lot more than they would really like.
Any other questions from you?
Go ahead.
Please. No?
I mean, I can add also, I work, by day I'm the book critic at Time Magazine, so I'm happy to talk about that as well. Anybody's curious about it. Oh, do you? Yeah, that's me. It's fine. Some people sometimes are confused. Are there two Lev Grossmans? Which would be odd because it's an unusual name, but in fact there's only one, using two different voices.
Neither of you are magical.
No, either one. Maybe there's a third magical one somewhere.
I think it's really exciting what you said about the collaboration between the reader and the writer, and that in your books you really want the reader to work, because we make theater with that. That's how we make theater. We don't make conventional theater just for entertainment, and that's an issue.
Yeah.
It's a question. So, do you read a book for entertainment? If it's too hard, do you want to read it? If you go to the theater, and uncomfortable? What do you do? Is
Yeah.
that okay? You know, those are all questions that come up if you look at it in a non-judgmental way, but just the issue itself. And I agree with you. I think I think that's the journey.
Yeah.
You know, in that.
You have to ask yourself, how much can you ask of your audience? What will they bring to this experience? And in some ways, you know, my books are not interpretively difficult in the way that the way a book like Ulysses is, or The Sound and the Fury. You know, I feel like there are concessions you have to make. This book, in some ways, asks a lot less, even than books like who's a difficult writer who's writing now. It's fewer and fewer of them. I don't know, like Jhumpa Lahiri, wonderful writer who I admire a lot. But you know, her novels, they're not as plot driven. Her work is not as plot driven. It's not as interpretively clear. It asks a lot of work from you. Probably my works are more accessible than that. And I think just mindful that I'm competing against video games, which frankly are a lot of fun. You know, you need to. I feel like I have to think realistically about what people need novels to do for them, and that is in some part to entertain them. Yeah.
What do you mean that you're competing against video games? Are you for an audience or for how you write or what?
For an audience, for their money and for their time, people have a finite amount of time they can spend being entertained, and they slice it up, and they make decisions about it, and they don't care about me or sending my kids to college. You know, they just got home from work and they're tired, and I think about, you know, when they're in that position, what are they going to reach for? And I love video games. I play them myself. Sometimes you just don't want a book, but sometimes you do. So you want to be the book that someone wants when they want a book, and it's a challenge. Yeah.
I was just wondering about your organizational process, about how you organize and get the story straight in your head. And like some people say, you start with the end, you go back to the beginning, or you chart it out, or you put index cards on. How do you conceive of your story and keep yourself going until you get from the beginning to the end?
It's difficult. It's difficult. I start knowing the beginning and knowing the ending, and being extremely unsure about all the stuff that becomes in between, which I think is common for writers. Someone once said, and I quote it all the time, I should find out who said it, that writing a novel is a lot like driving cross country at night. You know where you are, you know you're going to end up on the other coast, but you can only see about 50 yards ahead of you in the headlights. So I write outlines before I start. I'm too chicken to just go in and start improvising. I need some kind of a roadmap. And inevitably, the outline falls apart into little pieces, and then you pick them up and rearrange them some other way. It's usually better than the way you started. But I always start with a little outline, like an outline with like Roman numeral, big letter A, number that just shows all the scenes and what's going to happen in them. And then at some point I throw it away, but I need it, just to start out with. It's hard because it's hard to stay organized when you're writing something like this, 140,000 words. It's not even especially long by novel standards, but it takes about 2 years to write. You can lose your way very, very easily. It's a real challenge.
Do you write every day
No.
on a novel like this?
No. I can't. I mean,
No.
I have a job and 2 small children. It just doesn't work that way. And for a long time, I felt as though there was something wrong with me as a writer, that I did not write every day. Someone, probably Hemingway, that bastard, he was the guy who said that you had to write every day.
Tennessee Williams.
Was it?
Oh, yeah.
It's hogwash. Writing, I'm a binger. I need 5-6 hours. It takes me a while to get revved up. And then once I'm revved, I stay revved for a few hours. I don't noodle with something for half an hour a day. It's just, I can't do it. It's not for me.
Oh, sorry to, we have
More
a
guests?
woman here from the New York Times.
Yeah,
if you
okay.
don't mind.
Come on in.
Hi.
This way.
Oh, no, it's okay, thanks, it's about the whole scene.
Oh, okay. All right.
We have about 2 minutes till we have to go to the next.
We go to the next.
But you can stay for as long as you want.
Well, if it's 2 minutes, I'll just thank you all for coming so much. I truly appreciate it.
Well, thank you. It's very fascinating to hear you talk about your novel, but also to read from it. It's really fascinating. I never read anything. I didn't know about you before I heard about you, and you became our guest. But I'm definitely going to read your books. It's really very interesting and fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you very much. Yeah,
That's great.
great.
And thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming.
Do you have any questions that you'd like to ask Paul and I about Westbeth or anything?
Andy Warhol, Roy Lichtenstein, Gerhard Richter, who's a German artist, and Ed Ruscha, who's a pop artist in LA. This book, and I'm really here, I guess, to talk about this book, is published by Verso, which is known more for politics and theory than for art and culture. And it came out of texts that I did for both the LRB and for Artform. And it's really about the relationship of art and architecture over the last 4 or 5 decades. So as art, moved away from just the simple object sculpture did, moved into space, it began to engage architecture. And there's a way in which the other arts did the same thing. And so this book looks at how architecture was changed by this interface with art, and how art was changed too. So I read about sculpture, I read about installation, I read about film, but I also read about architects who are very influenced by artists. But one of the protagonists is Richard Serra, and it's do you all know who he is? We'll never know. Anyway, the cover image is an extraordinary project he did in the Grand Palais in Paris a couple of years ago. One of the great last industrial structures in Paris, and he placed these enormous steles, these enormous bands of steel in this different array, this sort of processional array. He called it promenade, which you pick up on promenades in Paris nearby. Anyway, what I thought I would do is just read a little bit of a conversation I have with Sarah. We are old friends, old antagonists, and he's a very intense guy. It would embarrass me a little bit less if I read his words rather than my prose. I really try to be a good writer, but I don't think I'm.
Do you mind if I ask you a question?
Sure.
What would you, who was the who or in multiples was the turning point where architects played such a role connecting art and architecture from your perspective?
Well, it depends how far back you want to go. Art and architecture were very close in the Renaissance.
Yeah.
Michelangelo,
Yeah.
great artist, not a bad architect. That's true in the Baroque too, Bernini and Borromini. So we're very close. It's only really with modern art, and even modernist art, 20th century art, where the idea that the arts should really be separated and really be concerned with what they are uniquely about. That art, visual art, and architecture began to separate. But even then, architects were very interested in art. I mean, Le Corbusier practiced as a painter too, for example, and artists were very interested in architecture. So even though we talk about modernist art in terms of medium specificity, where if you're a painter, you're really just a painter, and if you're a sculptor, you're really just a sculptor. There was a way in which there was an exchange, but in the recent past, the connections, the confusions have become extreme. I mean, it's almost like the Baroque again, where they co-produce elaborate spaces. So, in a way, Richard Serra calls out for Frank Gehry. Frank Gehry responds to Richard Serra. So it's become much more common that architects and artists work together. I mean, not always happily together. Serra, for example, even though he's learned quite a bit from architecture, pushes back on architecture really, really hard. And maybe I'll pass the book around and show you some examples of his work. But should I just read a couple of pages?
Sure.
Excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt. Before we start, do you mind just giving a little introduction? Thank you for coming, and I'm a little, just thank you for being here. I know, I'm sorry, we're just trying to put this for the Penn website.
Sure.
So that'll be amazing.
Into the
Thank
camera or just?
No, to everyone.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Imagine there's a teleprompter. Thank you for coming. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted that you are. And what can I say? I'm thrilled. What's that? So anyway, this is me versus Richard Serra. It's like a tag team wrestling, except there are only two of us. So almost from the beginning, I ask him, you have oriented your various interests in relation to sculpture. Why? He didn't begin as a sculptor, he began as a painter. And many of his peers who make objects and manipulate space don't use the word sculpture. John Judd, Carl Andre, people like that never said sculpture. So Serra responds, I think I can tell you. I started making my props. He began with these pieces of steel that he would prop against the wall and prop against each other so they could stand up. I started making my props. How do you hold something up against the wall? How do you use something on the wall to hold up something coming off the floor? How do you lean a couple of things together to make them freestand? There weren't any precedents for these props. They didn't come out of minimalism. I had done rolls of lead on the floor. Serra also began as an artist very interested in materials and processes. He would take actions on particular materials, and that would become the work. So he would use molten lead and roll it up. I understood that I could take material, roll it up, and it'd still be an object, even though it was primarily about its own making. Minimalism was completely divorced from process, whereas I was interested in manifestations of making, looking, and walking. This is about the mid-1960s. In a sense, all the early props have a relation to the body in terms of balance and counterbalance. They're an abstract reference to the body. So his work, unlike figurative sculpture, doesn't represent a body, it activates it really abstractly. Then I got to making House of Cards. That's a prop piece, a famous prop piece, which was basically 4 square, massive sheets of lead and props up so that they will hold each other up like a house of cards. Even though it seemed it might collapse, it was in fact freestanding. You could see through it, look into it, walk around it. And I thought, there's no getting around it. This is sculpture. I understood what my responsibilities were. If you say you're just an artist, you can do lots of things. You don't have to pin your having developed an understanding of tectonics, as to say structure. I thought I could make my sculpture. Me again. Apart from points of reference in Giacometti and Brancusi, were there resources for you, say, in David Smith and Mark de Subero? These are important American sculptors in the 50s and 60s. There's a David Smith show at Whitney right now. No, Carl Andre was important for me. Do you all know Carl Andre? He's the guy
Yes.
who did these bricks and plates
Yeah.
just right on the floor.
Actually, he lived in Westbeth for a while at the beginning.
He did? Fabulous. Or maybe fabulous for him, I don't know about for everybody else. Carl Andre was important for me, mostly because he didn't join his modules, his bricks or his plates. They were just butted up. These other guys, like David Smith, Mark DeSubro, they would weld pieces of steel, or DeSubro would assemble blocks of wood. One day I said to Carl, why don't you get those things up off the ground? And he said, don't worry, Richard, somebody will. And I thought, okay, I will. That's how it happened. What I love about these artists is that everything is really simple, at least in the beginning. This is me again. At that point, you were already interested in sculpture as an analog to the body in terms of balance, counterbalance, compression, friction. What happened when you put the plate in the corner and strike? This is a piece in which Sarah just took a massive plate of steel, stuck it in the corner of a gallery, and then at the Museum of Modern Art, and it just jutted out into space. This is how he responds. Strike came after House of Cards. It was my break into space. I realized if I wedged a plate into the corner, it would be freestanding. So I got a plate 8 by 24 feet that was strike. It declared the whole space, dividing it. In other words, it articulated the space simply by cutting it in two. And I realized I could hold the room, activate the room, the way that Dan Flavin did with his fluorescent lights. Only I could do it with my own material. But it took me a couple of years to catch up to that application. Me again. When you began to do the props, you were attending dance performances at Judson Church. It's just down the road. It's artists like Yvonne Rainer, Simone Forti, Tricia Brown. Dancers, choreographers are still very active today. Did it help you to understand the dynamic play of forces in your own work to watch these dancers dance? Yes. In that dance, this is Sarah again, in that dance, one figure would fall and another would catch and hold him or her. Judson Church is about very simple movements, very simple task movements as they called them. I saw things in terms of movement and equilibrium, stasis and balance that I could use in my sculpture. And I was faithful. I watched it all. For me, this is a very good example of how one artist or one art learns from another artist, another art. And this is very common in the 60s and 70s. Sarah also went to see films almost every night at the Anthology Film Archive. This is me again. What is extraordinary is that your claiming of sculpture, your move of picking up the Andre and activating the space around it, was also potentially a dissolving of sculpture into that space, into a field of process, movement, time. Sarah, what happens is when you get the once you get the sculpture off the ground and freestanding, you want to open up the field, you want to open up the space. And that took me a couple of more years. And these are very simple moves that he makes, but it takes him a long time to figure out the implications. Me again. Once you pull the sculpture up in the props, why pull it apart as well? Sarah, when I first lifted plates off the ground, I realized that it was also a limitation. There was a need to pull them apart, but I didn't know how. It didn't happen until Strike, piece that jutted from the corner. Strike showed me how to cut into space. Me again. Is that where your trip to Japan in 1970 and your encounter with Zen gardens comes into play? Yes, that was enormously important. The gardens open up a perceptual field. They made me rethink the field of Pollock painting, for example. More important is the time of the field and your movement through it. It's a physical time. It's compressed or protracted, but always articulated. Think about how it's like to walk through a Zen garden. I think that really was a key idea for Sarah, that he could somehow make sculpture that would have that effect of the body movement through articulated space. sometimes it narrows to details, but you are always returned to the field in its entirety. You can stop me whenever you get bored or whenever you have a question or comment. Let me just maybe skip ahead. He talks about other artists like Robert Smithson, Michael Heiser, how they moved out into earthworks, out into the wilderness, into the desert, and how that didn't interest him, because it just seemed to be like massive drawing on the desert. And he wanted to get away from sculpture as an image or sculpture as a drawn figure. So he was very close to Robert Smithson and Michael Heiser. In fact, after Smithson died in a plane crash in 1973, Sarah was asked to complete work that was underway. So they were very, very tight, but he resisted the move out into earthworks. And I actually always learned more from architecture. So I asked him about architecture. I say, your work is not about mixing sculpture and architecture. It's about understanding the structural principles they might share and developing them in sculptural terms. And as it make architecture, we understand structure and uses it for sculpture. Sarah, structure or tectonics is applied in the form-making principle of sculpture. First, in terms of the base, or if you don't use a base, in terms of how to get a given material off the ground. Then the question is how to do weight, mass, how do these things work? I have an advantage because I caught rivets and put up trusses as a kid working in steel mills. I knew enough about the industrial procedure, and I knew I could bring it into making art. Importing new models into a conservative art always gives you an advantage. Andy Warhol did it. So did Barbara Kruger. I think that's really key. And again, cut in if you want. So what Sarah basically did is that he used his experience as a kid in the Bay Area. His father actually was a pipe fitter in the shipyards there. And one of the primal scenes of his art, one of the most extraordinary experiences he had, this is a story he's told Sandy and me a couple of times now. His first memory was as a little boy, maybe 3, maybe closer to 4, and he was with his father, and his father took him to the launching of a ship that his father worked on, a huge, huge ship, into the bay in San Francisco. And what he remembers is that this huge, hulking mass. Imagine if you're 3 years old, you look up at this, freighter or whatever it is, and think, oh my God. And he remembers, the crack of the champagne bottle, and then the release of the ship, and this weight as it just began to let go, began to very, very slowly roll down the rollers and pick up speed, and then crash into the ocean, and plunge in, and then bounce up. And this it's almost a trauma of weight that finds its balance somehow and is righted into equilibrium. And that for him was a crucial memory of how to work with material and weight in space. But anyway, he worked as a poor kid. His father was a pipe fitter in mills in the Bay Area, and learned about how to to work with steel. And as the United States kind of entered into its industrial decline, I think artists like Sarah use industrial materials and processes as aesthetic forms, and almost aestheticize what was once part of the production of everyday structures and products. In a way, that's the story of art in Manhattan. Industrial neighborhoods like SoHo, as the light industry faded away, artists came in and used them, the spaces, as studios, and big spans allowed them to build, to industrial scale. There's people like Andre here, maybe in Westbeth, with Sarah and Tribeca, and that increased the scale of the art, and that increased scale led to a confrontation with architectural space. So there's this dialectic between the expanded scale of sculpture and the expanded scale of, say, museum architecture over the last 3 or 4 decades. But what interests me, I think maybe I'll stop and ask you what you're interested in. We go on to talk about how his work has become more and more complicated. He talks about tilted arc, he talks about other architecture, he talks about his relationship with Frank Gehry. But what interests me just in these early exchanges in this conversation is that Sarah is an artist who, almost on his own, redefines sculpture in relation to other arts, primarily architecture, and also, as he says, dance. He learned a lot about sculpture from dance. And he also opposed sculpture to painting. He began as a painter, but wanted to get away from the world of the image, the world of the virtual, in part because he saw that everything had become pop, and he wanted to insist on the actuality of our bodies, the reality of space. So even though he says he admires Warhol because Warhol changed his art form too, he made a radical revision of painting for the introduction of techniques from commercial design. In a way, Warhol and Sarah are opposite artists. Warhol's all about image, and Sarah is all against the image. In fact, our conversation is called building against image, or building contra image. But I've blathered on. I should engage you somehow.
So this is a book of essays between you and other artists?
No, it's all me except for this conversation that concludes the book.
Okay.
It begins with an overview of the role of image representation in architecture from the moment of pop architecture through postmodern architecture, which is really given over to signs and symbols. If you think about an architect like Robert Venturi or Michael Graves, they use lots of images. They see the building as surface. So that's about image building. That begins the book. The book concludes with this discussion about sculpture against image. And in between are 3 sections. First section deals with very significant architects in the world: Richard Rogers, Norman Foster, and Renzo Piano, who emerge as a group. And I see them in terms of a global style. We used to talk about architects like Le Corbusier and Gropius and Mies as the international style. I think Rogers, Foster, and Piano have produced a global style and an aesthetic look for the global world. And I'm very ambivalent about it. I think they're very distinguished designers in many ways, but they're master designers of this global moment, and then there are architects like those 3. So that's the first section. The second section, I look at architects who are very influenced by art. So I look at Zaha Hadid, who is very informed by futurist art and constructivist art. Then at our own Diller scoop video on Renfro, they're the ones who did the High Line. They're the ones who redesigned Lincoln Center. And they also did the Institute of Contemporary Art New Museum in Boston, the one that's right on the harbor.
Sure.
And they're very informed in performance art, feminist art. That's really where they began. And then lastly, I look at minimalist museums that are very informed by minimalist art. So I talk about Dia, the development of the Dia aesthetic. I talk about the New Museum of Modern Art. But I also look at architects like Kurtz and Dumoulin, Jean Nouvel, also very important architects of the day. And then very briefly, the third section is about artists who have ventured into architecture or who have transformed their own mediums in relation to architecture. So there's a chapter called Sculpture Remade, which is about Richard Serra, how he redefined sculpture in terms of architecture. Then there's a chapter on film, Anthony McCall, who does light projections. There's no images, no figures. He uses projections to sculpt space. So that's about film and interface with architecture. And then the yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think about that's true, but with Greenaway, isn't there always a elaborate narrative too? With McCall, he just uses the cone of light as film is so stripped bare. The title of that chapter is Film Stripped Bare. There's no image projected. It's just the projection of film as a way to sculpt space. And then
thinking about the stairs. I was thinking about the stairs.
Yeah. Maybe I should have mentioned him. And then I talk again very ambivalently about the development of this category of installation art, which is somewhere between painting and sculpture and architecture. So there is a certain history that one can get at once out of this book, kind of the relation of art and architecture over the last 40 or 50 years. So that's what that's about.
What do you think of the Highline?
Well, one tricky thing if you're a critic who's also a historian, sometimes you have personal or professional relationships with people. So Liz Giller is a colleague of mine at Princeton. So that doesn't mean that I can't be critical of her, and I am, but I actually think the Highline is a real success. I think the criticism is that it's part of a gentrification of the neighborhood, and it caters to a fairly limited class of people. But Sandy and I go up there all the time, and it's touristy, but there's a range of people. I mean, it's not just the white affluent folk. But what do you think?
I mean, I really like it. I live in the building, and I used to sneak up there when I was younger, when it was closed to the public.
Great.
Yeah. And it was always
What would you do? Don't tell us.
Nothing bad.
There was a big article in the Times about that. Did you ever see that? It was
No,
a picture of 3 boys.
Yeah.
2 of them lived in the building.
Oh, really?
And they used to go up there and
Yeah.
hang out. I mean, it's part of a whole transformation of the neighborhood.
Yeah.
I mean, it has its pluses and minuses. It was really grungy for a long time.
Yeah, that's for sure.
And kids growing up here,
Yeah.
to them is, some of them, it's adventurous. I did an interview with kids who grew up at Westbeth. I think you were.
I wasn't.
No.
I think my sister was.
Okay. So, right.
Yeah.
Yes, okay. And what it was like to grow up in Westbeth. Yeah, the pros and cons. Well, some people were mischievous and were off in these forbidden places with Grungeville. And others took it in a variety of ways being
Right.
here, but
Yeah, not so long ago, it was a tough part of town. I mean, just a little bit
not
further
so long
north.
ago,
Yeah.
right. The beginning was when they fixed the waterfront. You know,
Yeah.
that was a long-range plan.
I'm still nostalgic for, places like Florent, where
Oh
you
my
would go
God.
over there and
Yeah,
you know,
right.
it did seem to be another part of the city, not just a continuation of the mall that is Manhattan.
It was kind of otherworldly.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
isn't it?
Yes, it
I mean, the
definitely
character
was.
is still preserved in a way, but
Yeah.
all these fancy boutiques and.
It's like I walked down the
Yeah.
street and I'm like, so I was with someone in the building not long ago and we were like, where are we? Are we lost? Oh my God.
Yeah. It's still
Flagship
just,
store after store after
Yeah.
store, and all the tourists were just swamped with tourists, Mayor Bloomberg's dream.
yeah,
And they're buying clothes there.
yeah. What do you think about the Whitney that's moved?
I think that's horrible idea, horrible. My
tell us what
husband
you really
is
think,
freaking out, like, you're not going to be able to walk down the street here.
Yeah, well, that's obviously, it's a piano building. And it doesn't seem like it will be one of his better buildings.
Or
but,
just the idea of having really a residential neighborhood. I guess you'd say the Whitney's in a residential neighborhood uptown.
right. Yeah.
I'm not such a big fan of the original Whitney building.
No, that's one of my favorite buildings.
Really?
Yeah, why? It's
I
too
don't.
brutal.
I just find it. No, I mean aesthetically, I like to look at it, but I find for the experience of being in a museum, it's not.
Feels like a prison.
It's unyielding. It's
Yeah.
not that it's like a prison. It's just it doesn't like welcome me. You know, it's not
Yeah.
easy to float around and
Yeah, that's right.
yeah.
It's
So
not very
I'm
fluid
curious to see
space.
what the new.
It's not a very fluid space.
No,
No, that's true.
It's pretty
Yeah.
Yeah.
boxed.
I don't know.
Why do you like it so much?
Well, I'm a sucker for that kind of architecture. You know, it's brutalist. It really shows you its materials, and it's very emphatic about its spaces. And I'm a big fan of Breuer. He did some buildings in Princeton too. These were,
Down there. He also did at Lehman College. He did the art department.
Yeah, he was active,
Building.
and he's a great figure of the Bauhaus. He was a student at the Bauhaus and a teacher. Came to this country, Gropius and Albers and others. So he's an important figure for me. But I just like the building, I like the Guggenheim. But I do think that the High Line. I love the way that it allows you to look into the city and also look out to the river. It recaptures an experience.
And the growth is very nice, the natural.
Yeah.
The way
Yeah.
they use the natural growth in the
Yeah.
tracks, and I
That's
find that
that's
kind
actually
of
become a very active field in architecture, is landscape urbanism. As more and more cities have these industrial structures, but they don't know what to do with. I mean, they're not
Right.
earthquake safe. And, they don't want to necessarily tear them down. So I think it's actually a very good model. And there are others that have cropped up too. But, yeah.
What do you make of this balcony thing with the seating that overlooks what's that, 10th Avenue,
Yeah.
where you can watch the traffic? I thought, this is.
People seem to love it. I've never stopped there.
I'm telling you, it was packed. I went in the summer. I've only been there a couple of times. I
Yeah.
also like the landscaping. It's
Yeah, it's
not
nice.
wild and it's not sculptured and
Well,
it's not manicured.
It changes through the seasons too. I mean, they
Yeah.
design it
Really?
so
Oh, I
it
didn't know
really,
that.
whenever you go up there, it's somehow different.
Yeah, it brought a nice sort of greenery to a very sort of hard, plain, straight ahead space. But this balcony and watching the traffic, there wasn't a seat available. And I thought, what's up with that?
Well, maybe that is the tourist area where
It
you
must
come to the
be.
city, come to New York.
And just watch the traffic on 10th Avenue. It's what we like sitting home and watching the Weather Channel. I just didn't understand it.
Careful, some of us do that.
Yeah.
And we do. Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
It's a nice place to rest.
Yeah,
It's
that's
restful.
true.
And it's wonderful for kids who run up and down those stairs.
But to sit and watch the traffic.
Well, I think it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition of this like nice public space in the midst of the concrete jungle. It's like
I thought there must be a huge idea
Manhattan
behind
used
this that
to
I'm
be
not
at one
catching.
time you could sit in that place and watch a babbling brook and see trees and birds, you know, and then to sit there and see this completely new landscape unfolding. And I'm sure over the years it'll continue to change and grow. I mean, things change every 10 seconds in New York with new buildings and stuff like that.
Okay, all right. Then I'm just going to say one more thing. When I left it after a couple of hours, I just was mystified by it, and I thought about it, and I was like, well, there's very few places in the city where you could be stationary and be peaceful, and then things move around you. I mean, I suppose you could sit in Central Park or any park, but it was this idea that you would be stationary and relaxing in a place where there would be like things rushing out in front of you.
Yeah.
I thought, well, maybe there must be some sort of feeling there. I didn't catch the feeling because there wasn't any place to sit.
Europeans and other tourists, and even for us, one of the extraordinary things about Manhattan are canyons of the avenues. I mean, even the cross streets too, but just the sublimity of the major avenues. I think you have that kind of view in most cities. And I also think that there is a way in which Paris is the capital of the 19th century. New York is the capital of the 20th century. I think more and more people come here, and tourists, to see the city almost as an industrial museum. Skyscrapers. Cities develop very differently now, and buildings are built with a very limited life expectancy. In China, buildings are designed to last 20, 25 years. So these real kind of industrial monuments, in a way, it's true of the Eiffel Tower. You don't have to come to this country, but I don't know. The Empire State Building still, every time I look at it, just so knocks me out. I think that's part of the Highline effect. It's like a promenade onto the city as its own industrial museum, or 20th century museum.
What do you make of this whole push into Brooklyn? I mean, really rough neighborhoods like Red Hook and
Well,
and the artists are always like, it's the
they get
artists
pushed
and then the
further out.
gays, and then everybody else goes, great, thanks for doing this.
Exactly.
Thanks for helping us out.
Pioneers of gentrification. Yeah, that's actually very different too for artists because for the generation of Richard Serra, you could find a huge studio and a place to live in SoHo or Tribeca. Even for our generation, we lived on Grove Street for over 25 years. And when we first came to New York, when I first came to New York in the late 70s, I mean, I'm of the pictures generation of artists, like Sidney Sherman, Richard Prince, and Norman Kruger, all those people. We all live within, 10 blocks of each other.
Yeah, but people got lost 30 years ago for 10 or 20,000 and fixed it up themselves, but
Exactly. That's what I mean. You
It's
could do it.
unheard of now, so.
Well, that's what I mean. That artists, I guess, if they could still live together, they live together, in the furthest Bushwick. But they tend to be more scattered, and that actually hurts an artist community. I mean, maybe they're all, on the net together, texting, but you really have to, you have to somehow scrape by, save a little bit of money if you're an artist or writer, and you have to live in proximity to other artists and writers. I mean, it's a crucial formula. I mean, you guys have it here in spades, but I think that's more and more difficult, and certainly in New York it is.
It's difficult even here.
Yeah.
Are you sorry about the Savoy closing?
Yes.
Yeah.
All the restaurants.
Yeah.
No, I mean, our neighborhood has become just so hip, we can't stand it.
You're ready to move to Red Hook.
I wouldn't go that far, but Sandy, every month or so, she will scold a super hip barista from Redhook who gives her attitude. Do you know how long I've lived in this neighborhood? You can't treat me like this.
I'll bet.
I mean, part of the story of art and architecture is the transformation of neighborhoods, and towns. Be a beacon. We used to call it beacon.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
For coming
Thank you
by.
very, very much.
Gosh, shucks.
Want to get you down.
So how long have you been teaching at Princeton?
How long have you been there?